Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Davide Gasparotto. I'm the Senior Curator of Paintings and Chair Curatorial Affairs here at the Getty Museum. Just before we started, a few housekeeping information. For guests here in the lecture hall, please take a moment to silence your mobile devices, while for online attendees, closed captioning has been enabled. To access live captioning, click the CC icon on the Zoom menu bar at the bottom of the screen. And later, after the talk, time permitting, we may be able to take some questions. For our online audience, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom menu bar. And for those here in person, instead, there will be a mic available so that everyone can hear your question. In 2021, we acquired a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi, arguably the most famous woman painter of the early modern period. The work depicts the Roman noblewoman Lucretia grasping a dagger a few instants before killing herself, a tragic story told by the historian Titus Livius, which supposedly happened in the 6th century before Christian era. I was very proud of this acquisition, being the first painting by this remarkable artist to enter our collection. But some colleagues objected. Why we celebrate Artemisia with such a dark subject, the story of a woman who killed herself because she was raped and thought that her honor and virtue were irreparably compromised? I reflected for a long time upon this objection. Today, my answer would be twofolded. On one side, we are in presence of an artwork whose technical accomplishment, emotional power, and beauty goes beyond the specificity of the individual episode to embody a universal meaning regarding human suffering and self-inflicted pain. On the other side, it forces us to confront with the past, which is very different from our present, a past that we do not necessarily approve, but that we do not have to censor, so it conforms to our current cultural or political concerns, a past that we are here not to judge, but instead to understand. One of my professors at the university used to say, "History is like the pig. You don't throw away anything, even, or perhaps especially, when it reveals inconvenient or uncomfortable truths." It was while I was trying to understand why Lucretia's story, which we now found repulsive, had such an enduring appeal in classical antiquity and in early modern Europe, in particular in the visual arts, that I came across Giulia Sissa's scholarly work. Giulia was trained as a classicist in Italy and France, and she did her PhD in the very stimulating intellectual milieu of the prestigious Centre de Recherche Comparée sur les Sociétés Anciennes, Center for Comparative Research in Ancient Societies in Paris. After teaching in France, she moved to the US, where she has been professor of classics at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. She is currently the distinguished professor in the Department of Classics and Political Science here at UCLA. Giulia's scholarly work is primarily focused on the role of women in ancient Greek and Roman societies, always connecting the study of the past to moments of reception and significant resonance in the modern world. In one of her most recent books, Le Pouvoir des Femmes, The Power of Women, Sissa traced the cultural construct, which goes back to the Greek philosopher Aristotle and was handed over to Christian thinkers such like St. Augustine, of the male as a political animal and the female as a domestic animal. But there were exceptions that Sissa explored at length, and the Greeks themselves were able to imagine heroic women, authoritative mothers, warrior queens. It is about these exceptional women that she will focus her attention in today's lecture, in particular on Lucretia, providing us with an essential entry point into their enduring appeal and allure. Please join me in welcoming Giulia Sissa to the podium.
Good afternoon. I wish to express, first of all, my deep gratitude to the J. Paul Getty Museum, its director, Timothy Potts, and Davide Gasparotto, and Greg Sandoval for their kind invitation. It is such an honor to be here for me on the very Acropolis of Los Angeles. Thank you. Once upon a time, there were only men on earth. Some of them were cowards. They died and then were reborn as a new kind of human beings, women. Women, therefore, are the very embodiment of dread, faint-heartedness, lack of courage. This sad story is told not by any old mythographer, but by Plato in the Timaeus, the book that Plato carries in Raphael's fresco in the stanza of della Signatura in the Vatican. Once upon a time, gods and humans, all males, used to live together and eat the same food, and then Zeus deprived humankind of fire. When, in response, Prometheus stole fire on behalf of those miserable mortals, well, Zeus ordered the fabrication of a beautiful evil, woman. In Hesiod's epic poem, Works and Days, the first woman is named Pandora. She brings miserable cares into the world. She receives from Athena the arts of weaving, cloth, ornaments. Golden Aphrodite pours grace upon Pandora's head along with desire. Women are soft, deceptive, seductive. These narratives convey a line of thought. The difference between women and men is what it is because it came to be in a certain timeline. At the beginning, humanity was pure masculinity and it worked just fine. Later, that primordial humanity as masculinity, that essentially male humanity was obliged to make space for new beings, flawed beings, those misshaped, unhelpful, annoying humans we call women. But these are just myths. These are just entertaining stories. These are figments of the imagination. Yes, indeed, but narration is a way of thinking, a way of situating beings in the world before, after, a way of allotting praise and blame, self-sufficiency versus degeneration, courage versus cowardice. We can certainly ignore what we call myth, but then so much culture in so many cultures becomes insignificant. Cultures are infused with narration, made up with narrations, and kept together or disrupted by narrations. Remove any shred of narration from any museum, what is left? We want to listen to and look at narrative thinking. Firstly, because there is meaning there, and secondly, because these meanings circulate in all societies. In classical Greece, vases showed a visual version of the myth of Pandora. This is a sort of pop art. Hesiod's poetry was well known and often quoted, but the most compelling reason why we must take a cultural approach to mythology as a way of thinking is that a society like democratic Athens treated women exactly as if they were cowardly men, as Plato says, exactly as they were frivolous creatures, as Hesiod says. Historically, in ancient democracy, the rule of the people by the people, women were indeed second-class citizens. Democracy is a form of government, a way of partaking in kratos, in power, and women were barred from partaking in kratos. No attendance to popular assemblies, no membership in the governing body, the boulé, the council, no selection by lot, no election to office, no involvement in popular law courts, no military training, no war, nothing. The demos is a man, a manly man. Women live their lives at home. Here is demos in person. Now, in the 4th century BCE, a philosopher, Aristotle, rationalizes Athenian political reality. Women are less endowed with vital heat than men, he thought. They are weaker, less spirited, less courageous. The courage of a woman would be cowardice for a man. Women are less capable of making decisions. Their deliberative faculties without authority. Metaphorically, women lack an interior Homeric king, a commander who makes resolute, firm, unwavering determinations about what to do. Women are soft. La donna è mobile is not just an operatic area, it is a theory of gender. It is only natural, therefore, that women cannot be citizens and soldiers. Femaleness is a true disability. Now, similar ideas circulated in Roman culture, from the foundational tale of the rape of the Sabaean women to the sensuality and, again, softness that defines femininity at large for poets such as Ovid. Now, let me pause and ask for all of us, is that all? Is this the only template for gender in ancient Greece and Rome? Systemic prejudice, polarization, binary thinking, and exclusion from politics and wars, is that all? It is time to look around and discover at least one place where this line of thinking was derailed spectacularly, and this is the theater. Theatrical thought calls into question the stable opposition of female and male. This is Antigone in chains, standing in front of the king of Thebes, Creon. In Sophocles' famous play, she is accused of performing a minimalist ritual for her brother Polynices' corpse. The king had proclaimed that no one should pay respect to that body. Yes, the young man had declared war on his own city-state. Yes, he was a friend and had become a foe. And so, what? I will bury him, Antigone claims, and it will be beautiful to die doing so. Her sister Ismene is the ordinary woman from the Athenian Aristotelian script. We were born women. We are ruled. We don't fight those in power, she whimpers. 2 women, 2 possibilities, 2 decisions. Antigone decides to pour a handful of dust on the putrefying cadaver. In retribution, the king buries her alive in a cave. She refuses to remain at the mercy of his half-baked condemnation. She takes her own life into her own hands, first as she performs the funeral rites for her brother, and later as she hangs herself. And yet Antigone does not become a man. On the contrary, she acts as a woman and a sister. According to the norms of the city-state, both the city on stage, Thebes, and the city of the spectators, Athens, she must take care of her brother's dead body. Pace, Hegel, Greek city-states protect the family. In Sophocles' play, the people of Thebes, the city itself, praise Antigone as a glorious girl and woman. The priest of Apollo is on her side entirely. However, Creon is a tyrant. His proclamation creates a state of exception in which normal expectations are thwarted. In order to perform the most basic feminine act for her deceased brother, which is good for the family and good for the state, now a sister must disobey, transgress, be resolute, and challenge the rule. Antigone shows that courage is a quality that can be compatible with femininity. Always, not always, not in Athenian democracy, not in her sister's mind. These are disruptive exceptions. These exceptions don't confirm the rules, they disclose other possibilities. And now, Rome. Artemisia Gentileschi looks back to Rome. One of her favorite subjects was Lucretia, a Roman matron who was raped and decided to take her own life. Unlike Antigone, Lucretia is believed to be a historical figure. Traditionally, her suicide is dated to 509 BCE. In response to the rape and self-inflicted death, a member of Lucretia's husband's family, Lucius Junius Brutus, started a revolt that overthrew the ruling king, his uncle, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. This was the end of monarchy and the beginning of a new form of government in Rome, the Republic. Tarquinius Superbus was the last king of Rome before the establishment of the Republic in 509 and before the later restoration of a new kind of monarchic rule. In the 1st century BCE, Julius Caesar attempted and failed to become a rex, he was murdered, and then Octavian Augustus implemented an astute institutional alteration of the Republic, the so-called Principate. Lucretia's rape and self-inflicted death, therefore, can be seen as the foundational violence of the Roman Republic. But how do we know about Lucretia's life, deeds, and demise? The earliest evidence comes from two sources. The first is Titus Livius, known as Livy, the author of a history of Rome from its very foundation. Livy flourished between 59 before the Common Era and 17 of the Common Era. The other source is a very great poet who lived slightly later, also at the very beginning of the Christian era. They both portray Lucretia as a woman who chooses death over life. Like Antigone, Lucretia was represented and rethought again, and again over 2 millennia as a fascinating yet highly problematic character. Who is Lucretia? A strong woman or a proud girl? A proto-feminist or a victim of patriarchy? A sexualized object of male imagination or an explosive singularity who calls into question cultural expectations? Is she a woman who becomes a man or a woman who shows what women can do, what women can be? Is she a possible woman who reveals exemplary possibilities to other women? Let us dive together into these dramatic stories, first Livy and then Ovid. I must warn you that we are going to read vivid descriptions of sexual violence. Sextus Tarquinius is a young man. He has seen Lucretia and has begun already to lust after her. Taking advantage of her husband's absence, one evening he called at her house. Lucretia graciously welcomed him because he was a relative. They had dinner. Then, drawing his sword, he came to the sleeping Lucretia, holding the woman down with his left hand on her breast, pectore oppresso. He said, "Be still, Lucretia. I'm Sextus Tarquinius. My sword is in my hand. Utter a sound and you die." When he found her resolute and not to be moved even by fear of that, he went farther and threatened her with disgrace, saying that when she was dead, he would kill a slave and lay him naked by her side, that she might be said to have been put to death in adultery with a man of base condition. Thanks to this terrifying threat, his victorious lust victoriously, the Latin text insists on these words, connected words, prevailed on her resolute modesty, just as with violence. Then Tarquinius ferox the parties, having conquered a woman's honor. Artemisia again. Lucretia sends for her husband and father. They seek to comfort her. They tell her that it is the mind that sins, not the body, and that where purpose has been wanting, there is no guilt, there is no culpa. But she answers, "You will take care of the man. For my own part, though I acquit myself of the sin, I do not absolve myself from punishment, nor in time to come shall ever unchaste woman live, thanks to the example of Lucretia." Let me repeat the words in Latin because they are going to be important in a moment. Ego me, etsi peccato absolvo, supplicio non libero, nec ulla deinde impudica Lucretia exemplo vivet. Taking a knife which she had concealed beneath her dress, she plunged it into her heart and, sinking forward upon the wound, died as she fell. In this painting by Lorenzo Lotto, the sentence that Livy attributes to Lucretia is written verbatim on the sheet of paper placed on the table. "Nor in time to come shall ever unchaste woman live, thanks to the example of Lucretia." Lucretia herself wants to die in order to become an exemplum. The lady in the painting is pointing at that sentence. So this was Livy's account of the assault. What are the most salient moments? First of all, the violence. Sextus is an enemy rather than a guest. He comes armed with violence. He threatens to kill both Lucretia and a slave. He truly is Tarquinius Ferox. Lucretia is absolutely certain that he is the perpetrator, that she is absolutely innocent, that her father and her husband will be on her side. No doubt about the patriarchal protection she can count upon. If they are vires, if they are men, they will vindicate her, and they do so. No second guessing here, not the slightest suspicion. The two men lecture her on the disconnection between body and soul. There is no culpa on her side. But Lucretia makes her own decision for herself. I absolve myself from the fault, but I do not evade the punishment. This is a really tragic predicament. You do something involuntarily, but nonetheless you want to punish yourself. Think of Oedipus. He killed involuntarily his father. He married involuntarily his mother, and still he blinds himself. In a sense, he kills his eyes that didn't recognize his parents. So here Lucretia is not afraid of dying when Sextus threatens her. Rather, she is terrified at the prospect of being dead, of being a lifeless corpse placed near a slave's corpse, a dishonor that she would not be able to vindicate. After the rape, she kills herself precisely because she still faces that fearlessly. And now she has a purpose, to become an exemplum. Thanks to her example, no woman will live unchaste. No woman will live unchaste on account of her example. Death will be the witness to her blamelessness, mors testis eris. And finally, let me draw attention to her motion. Lucretia plunges the knife into her chest, the chest that Sextus had violently crushed. Then she thrusts herself onto the knife. To face death is not just a metaphor. And now Ovid. As you can see, the narrative is very similar. The steel is in my hand, Lucretia, say the king's son, and I that speak, I am Tarquin, and she not a word. She trembles like a little lamb confronting a wolf. What could she do? Should she struggle? Should she cry out? Should she flee? His hands pressed heavy on her breast, the breast that until then had never known the touch of a stranger hand. And then the threat, I, the adulterer, will bear false witness to your adultery. I'll kill a slave and you will be dishonored. Overcome by fear of infamy, she gave away, succumbuit. Why, Victor, this is the poet speaking to his character, why, Victor, do you rejoice? This victory will ruin you. And then the suicide. Lucretia's husband and Lucretia's father pardoned the deed and force. She said, the pardon that you give, I do refuse myself. Without delay, she stabbed her breast with the steel she had hidden, and weltering in her blood, sanguinolenta, fell at her father's feet. Even then, in dying, she took care to sink down decently. And now again, what is that most matters for Ovid? What emerges as the most striking, significant, and abhorrent aspect of the attack? Again, the roughness, the haste, the sheer brutality, the stupid victory. And again, the focalization on the breast. Lucretia decides, transfixes her chest with the blade and falls covered in gore. This is the virginal breast that the predator had crushed. And again, as in Livy's account, Lucretia trusts the men who are expected to protect her. They believe her, and they will take revenge, man to man. The poet's language and the choice of details convey a straightforward message here. This attack is appalling. Any reader of Ovid in antiquity, and hopefully today, could not possibly miss it. I feel compelled to say this because Ovid has been accused of a complacent representation of rape in his poetry. Ovid wrote an epic poem, The Metamorphoses, in which he recounts myriad erotic encounters, some of which are explicitly described as violent assaults. For instance, Zeus, the king of the gods, rapes a young woman named Io. The god utilizes vis, violence, and the poem underscores Io's suffering. In the same poem, Ovid describes episodes of courtship that may seem excessively persistent to contemporary readers. However, from Ovid's perspective on love, these are attempts to seduce, not rape a woman. Seduction differs significantly from the violence, the vis, that Zeus imposes on Io. To acknowledge the poem's discourse on sexuality in its own terms, we must pay attention to these internal differences rather than reducing all instances of wooing to rape on account of our own personal, political, moral ideas about sexuality. It is essential to acknowledge textual taxonomy and to put them in a cultural context. The Metamorphoses generates a taxonomy of amorous possibilities, but there is more to say about Ovid. Ovid wrote a poem entitled The Art of Love. In it, he cast himself as a master of love, a magister amoris. From beginning to end, the art of love is the art of avoiding rape. What are the teachings of the master of love? Be patient and adjust to your beloved's personality, taste, and rhythm. Offer gifts, poem, compliments, and endless admiration. Make your company enjoyable. Play 1,000 games that may please a young woman. Mille facesse giocos. Cultivate entertainment she might like, such as table games, music, dance, poetry, and conversation. Leave any piece of martial equipment and belligerent behavior outside her cozy interior. The goal is slowly to captivate her desire for you without ever pushing or forcing her. If you succeed, young men, in approaching the beloved physically, do not be ruthless. Try not to bite her tender lips when kissing her. During sex, make sure you maintain the same pace. Be considerate of a woman's reputation. In short, make yourself lovable. The third book of The Art of Love is addressed to women because they must also learn how to love. For both genders, the art of love is the art of being loved. Ultimately, the young Roman man should remember that if one woman rejects him, which is entirely possible, there are many others who will reciprocate his desire. The art of love, in conclusion, offers a benchmark, a touchstone, a criterion for determining the quality of a man's erotic conduct. We can compare and contrast any Ovidian lover with the ideal student of the Magister Amoris in the art of love. Now, if for Ovid this is the model of the knowledgeable, urban, and artful lover, then Sextus Tarquinius, aptly surnamed Ferox, is the worst possible cad. He pretends to be polite at dinner, but he's actually an assailant who has planned his ambush. He is an armed enemy, a rash, imperious, threatening, harmful, cruel predator. He takes his own pleasure like a tyrant. He also takes advantage of the law. Everything about him is pure ruthlessness, the very opposite of what Ovid considers to be a doctus lover. Tarquinius is a rapist. Lucretia's husband and father fully understand the rape. Again, nobody dares to blame the victim except Lucretia herself. All covered in gore, sanguinolenta, she falls at her father's feet. Lucretia is both a swift, premeditating killer and a sacrificial victima crashing to the ground. And Brutus picks up the dripping knife, stillantem cultrum, and declares revenge. The rest is Roman history, and it's art history too. Now, I would like to situate these poignant narratives in the context of Roman culture at the time when Livy and Ovid flourished, the 5th century BCE, a period we used to call Augustan. On the one hand, I will outline the Roman legislation on adultery and rape. On the other, I will bring to bear on Lucretia a philosophical understanding of death as the quintessential challenge to a person's character. This philosophy is Stoicism. Briefly, the Julian law on the repression of adultery, Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis, was introduced by the Emperor Augustus in 18 BCE. Let us briefly, again, highlight the core concepts. Adulterium is sex between a man and a woman who is married to another man. The fact that the adulterer man himself may be married or not is not relevant at all. Adulterium concerns the monogamy and chastity of a woman. Men are promiscuous with impunity. Now, stuprum, usually translated as debauchery or fornication, is sex with a virgin, a widow, a non-married woman, or a boy. Both adulterium and stuprum are punishable. A husband is entitled to kill the adulterer man if he catches him while he has sex with his wife. A father may kill both the adulterer man and his own daughter if the sex act has been committed in his own house or the house of his son-in-law. Why? Because the heat and impetuosity of the husband who decides too quickly should be restrained so the father can kill the girl or the woman. The husband must repudiate his wife if she commits adultery voluntarily, lest he can be accused of lenocinium, of plundering. Why? Because the husband should be angry against his wife who has violated her marriage vow. In addition to allowing the rightful killing of an adulterer on the spot, the law sets the stage for a legal procedure. If the husband fails to denounce an adultery, any man external to the family may do so after 60 days. Witnesses are involved. False testimony is a crime. An adulterer has a lot to lose. Financially, with the confiscation of half of his possessions, as a citizen, with the loss of important rights, such as becoming a soldier or acting as a witness. And finally, the Lex Julia makes provisions regarding slaves. A slave can be prosecuted for adultery. He will be tortured. And now, how about the woman involved in adulterium? If brought to trial and convicted of voluntary adultery, a wife is condemned to confiscation of half of her dowry and 1/3 of her possessions. She is also condemned to relegatio on an island. Her lover, the adulterer, loses half of his property and is relegated to, but on a different island. The law does not apply to women slaves. Now, the crucial point here is intent. Deliberate intention is relevant for the man. The law exists, quote, in order that no one may knowingly and fraudulently commit debauchery or adultery. And deliberate intention, consent, what we call consent, is equally essential for the woman, quote, for anyone who is violated, who suffers violence, cannot be convicted of adultery or fornication on this account. Why is it relevant to scrutinize this law? There exists, as we know, a spirit of the laws. In Augustan Rome, the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis creates a set of technical provisions, of course, but also reveals a normative mentality, a set of values, an ideological climate. Levy's and Ovid's narratives can be better understood in the context of this legal culture. Both are compatible with the Lex Julia. They even allude directly to the Lex Mennis aspects. The calculated, brutal, unforgivable, hostile violence of the adulterer man who violates a married woman in the conjugal bed. The undoubtable innocence of the victim who suffers patitur, that vis. The plausibility of Sextus Tarquinius' malicious threat to give false testimony as a witness. The plausibility of the lie he might tell that Lucretia had an affair with a slave. The law also takes into consideration the reaction of Lucretia's husband and father. They do not doubt her. They promptly grant venia, which means that actually there is nothing to forgive. There is no culpa. There is absolutely no causa for any possible condemnation. I quote again, for anyone who is violated, who suffers violence, cannot be convicted of adultery or fornication on this account. But the outrage to pudicitia can be experienced as distinct from the legal situation. Lucretia refuses to accept the venia. There is no fault, peccatum, she agrees, but she will inflict a self-punishment, a supplicium, to herself. How are we to understand her intransigence? Lucretia knows only too well how impeccably innocent she is, but something objectively outrageous has happened to her. Other women can look to her example. They might think that she was a consenting adulteress. St. Augustine, as we shall see in a moment, insinuates that she was. But is this a Roman way of thinking? To answer this question, I will now turn to the second context, Stoicism. This is a philosophy in which ethics is especially important. We must aim at being wise and eradicating the passions and living a life of constantia and virtue. There are four basic passions: overestimation of a present or future good, pleasure and desire; overestimation of a present or future evil, distress and fear. The experience of pain can be managed by refusing to consent to the perception of an overvalued evil in the present. Fear can be abolished by refusing to consent to the perfection of an overvalued evil in the future. We can, therefore, minimize both the fear of death and the pain to be felt in the very event or in the deliberate act of dying. To take our own life can be, in certain circumstances, such as military defeat, political oppression, or personal humiliation, a manner of facing death fearlessly, resolutely, and somehow anesthetically, as if it were a matter of will. Now, this is Stoicism. Contrary to the contemporary revival of Stoicism as a brand of encouraging useful personal development, ancient Stoicism was exacting, unforgiving, and brutal. Seneca was the most prominent Roman Stoic philosopher in the first century of the Common Era. He died in 65 Anno Domini. Seneca theorized the beauty of terminating one's own life voluntarily. He offered the example of a man who famously had decided to die in order not to live under Julius Caesar, whom he considered a tyrant. This man was Cato Minor. Seneca praises him according to the values of Stoicism. Cato lived a good life. He died honorably. Death, I'm quoting, is itself neither an evil nor a good. Cato experienced death most honorably. Everything, if you add virtue, assumes a glory which it did not possess before. Yes, there are people who, when summoned to die and ordered to bare their throat, refuse to do so, try to prevaricate, even may ask permission to go to the loo. Literally, they could not stand firm in front of death, their chest ready. There are people like Cato, mors honesta, a noble, fine death. Let us remember Antigone's project to die beautifully, kalos. She does stand firm in front of Creon. We have seen her. Now Cato looks back not to Antigone, not to any other woman from the past, but to Socrates. We learn from Plutarch, who wrote a biography of Cato, the poignant and gory tale of how Cato spent his last evening taking a bath, having dinner, conversing with his friends. They discussed not any philosophical topic, but the paradoxes of the Stoics, namely that the good man alone is free and that the bad are all slaves. And everyone perceived that he had made up his mind to put an end to his life and free himself from his present troubles. Then, in the early morning, Cato stabbed himself in the belly. This is Stoicism. Seneca, as well as Plutarch, sees Cato as a paradigm of Stoicism, not only on account of how Cato lived his life, but also and above all on account of how he died, how he faced death bare chest. Now again, Lucretia is not a Stoic philosopher, but Livy shapes her persona. She is obstinata in such a way that she can be perceived as being profoundly in tune with the Stoic attitude of a wise man. Like Socrates, Cato and Lucretia have the options of continuing to live, but they resolve to terminate their existence on their own terms. Their affinity is not a modern interpretation. Already in Rome, their like-mindedness was recognized. A master of eloquence who flourished in the 1st century of the Common Era, Quintilian, in his canonical work, The Orator's Education, went as far as to instruct public speakers to mention the example of Lucretia as a powerful argument on virtue. Precisely because a woman's courage is not obvious, a fortiori such courage is extraordinary, outstanding, and praiseworthy. Lucretia, Quintilian writes, is not merely as courageous as Cato. She is more admirable than Cato. If we are speaking on facing death, Cato and Scipio will be less persuasive than Lucretia. Lucretia's intransigence vis-à-vis herself is attuned to a Stoic act of contempt for extreme hardship, for death. While being assaulted, she was determined to fight and die in order to defend her chastity. She only succumbed to protect her honor. If she had died, Sextus would have made her look like an adulteress. She was humiliated and defeated, but now she reappropriates her own death. One last time, I would like to draw our attention to the leitmotif of baring one's chest. Lucretia's breast is a point of focalization in Livy's and Ovid's narration. The breast is, of course, an erotic part of the female body, but this is exactly where Lucretia decides to plunge her knife. Her vulnerability is converted into an affirmation of resoluteness. She falls down on the blade, prolabor, like Ajax. If we read Seneca on Cato versus people who are unable to face death, if we look at the paintings inspired to those texts, when Lucretia's partial nudity, especially in Artemisia Gentileschi paintings, then that partial nudity acquires a different meaning. Far from playing with voyeurism, these paintings suggest a stoic Lucretia. The resemblance of Lucretia and Cato in their intrepid will to die surfaces in Christianity. One of the most authoritative Christian thinkers, theologians, and doctor of the church is St. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo. At the beginning of the City of God, Augustine discusses them both, namely Lucretia and Cato, back to back. This is a monumental work written in the 5th century on the place of the Christian revelation in human history, which raises the all-important question of why God wanted the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. The answer is that this particular empire would be propitious to the diffusion of Christianity. Why? Because the Romans could offer to the Christians a unique example. The example of their own powerful love for their own homeland. Were the Romans not enamored of glory? Did they not use precisely that one vice, gloria, in order to curb their other vices, such as greed and lust? Did they not build their empire thanks to their love of land and their passion for glory? Well, according to Augustine, the Christians had to learn to love their own city, the city of God, as passionately as the Romans had loved and had fought for their own terrestrial city, Rome, thereby making it into a mighty empire. Now, in the eyes of Augustine, patriotism explains the Roman success, but does not excuse their multiple flaws, including their polytheistic religion and their morality. Flourishing before the birth of Jesus Christ, they could not benefit from his teaching. Gloria is still a vice. Augustine, therefore, constantly compares and contrasts Christians and Romans. In this vast perspective, it tackles the issue of suicide. This is just homicide, he argues. It cannot be condoned, even less celebrated as a form of virtus. The Romans were wrong in their glorification of these two figures, Lucretia and Cato. So Pace Livy, Ovid, Quintilian, Seneca, Plutarch, and Tully, these two were not admirable at all. The Stoics were especially wrong, according to St. Augustine. They were ill-advised on many accounts, but their worst mistake was the idealization of the wise person as dispassionate, imperturbable, stoic, as we still say, in front of death, to the point of killing oneself. The City of God is a turning point in the history of Lucretia's destiny. In the 17th century, when Artemisia Gentileschi paints multiple versions of Lucretia's vicissitudes, we are in a fully Christian world. Let us read together how Augustine changes dramatically the perception of her acts. St. Augustine seems to have read both Livy and Ovid, but now Lucretia's conduct creates a dilemma for a Christian reader. Since taking one's own life is just that, taking a life, then Lucretia is the author of a crime. She has condemned herself to death without a trial. Is such a condemnation justified? St. Augustine performs a thought experiment here. Let us assume that she was absolutely innocent, that she did not consent at all, not even secretly, to the rape. Let us admit that she was perfectly chaste. Then, by killing herself, she killed an innocent victim. Then, her decision to condemn herself to death without trial was an unjust punishment. This crime was committed by Lucretia. That Lucretia, so celebrated and lauded, slew the innocent, chaste, outraged Lucretius. As a killer of a guiltless wife, Lucretia cannot be praised. She, Lucretius the killer, deserved to be punished. Let us now assume that Lucretia did participate in the adultery as a consenting partner. Then again, as the victim of the killing, Lucretia cannot be praised. Why? Because she was an adulteress. Now, note that Augustine is not arguing that an adulterous woman would deserve to be killed. No, Augustine is trying to say that once again, Lucretia cannot be praised. Not as the killer of herself, if she's innocent, not as the killed, if she has committed adultery. If she was the adulteress, why praise her? If chaste, why slay her and praise the slayer? The entire argument concerns the Romans and their erroneous celebration of suicide. What matters is the undue glamorization of an act of violence that in truth is a manifestation of gloria, the quintessentially Roman vice. Lucretia, a Roman woman, excessively avid of praise, laudis avida nimium, killed herself simply out of pride. Because she was an innocent victim, she could not bear the burden of shame. In fact, she blushed at the possibility of being believed to be an accomplice of the deed if she were to bear passively the shame that another had actively inflicted upon her. St. Augustine is doing two things here. First, he takes literally Ovid and Livy's narrative. Lucretia acted out of shame, but shame is not good here. Second, St. Augustine interprets Lucretia's intent like a modern anthropologist trying to compare Roman and Christian mores. The Romans were a shame culture. What mattered for them was optics, reputation. The Christians were a guilt culture. They cared about the purity of intent. This is why, unlike Lucretia, the Roman woman, the Christian martyrs who suffered a sexual assault were able to bear the burden of shame. What matters, according to St. Augustine, is the inner glory of chastity, intus gloriam castitatis. By killing herself for gloria in other people's eyes, Lucretia failed to understand true sanctity. She was a Roman. Now, following this line of thought, Augustine goes on to associate Lucretia and Cato. Besides Lucretia, I quote, the advocates of suicide have some difficulty in finding any other prescriptive example, unless that of Cato, who killed himself at Utica. Was it virtus? No, it was, yet again, a matter of gloria. Cato would not bear his defeat by Julius Caesar. Ultimately, the Romans were fundamentally wrong about good and evil. They saw admirable value in the very sin that for St. Augustine was the original sin, namely pride, superbia. Lucretia and Cato were just murderers, albeit of themselves. They were guilty of pride, which is the root of all the other vices, incapable of humility, which is the root of all the virtues. And this, it is to be expected from people untouched by the revelation and redemption. The Stoics, therefore, were bad philosophers. The history of these ideas can be brought to bear on our understanding of Lucretia, including her depiction by Artemisia Gentileschi. Gentileschi painted Lucretia at least 4 times. Did she mean to portray a self-centered, egocentric, and proud woman? Proud in the negative sense St. Augustine theorizes? Was she depicting a female killer? In the purview of Christianity, a suicide, again, is just a homicide. Lucretia murdered Lucretia. No excuse, no praise. By the 17th century, however, there were many who saw Lucretia once again in a heroic light. I could mention Christine de Pizan, Coluccio Salutati, Margaret Cavendish, Juan Luis Vives, but it is time to conclude. I will do so with just one example, Giovanni Boccaccio. Giovanni Boccaccio included Lucrezia in his book on illustrious women in 1374. Boccaccio, excuse me, called Lucretia the guide of Roman chastity. He wrote that she was unafraid of death, mortis impavida, that she suffered the rape only because if she had let Sextus kill her, nobody would have vindicated her innocence. Boccaccio highlighted the vicious, cunning approach of the tyrant's son, who took advantage of the trust of the young woman precisely because she was a relative, who threatened, blackmailed, and intimidated her, his victim. Boccaccio's Lucretia utters the same word as Livy's Lucretia. Though I absolve myself of the fault, I do not elude punishment, nor in time to call shall ever unchaste woman live through the example of Lucretia. We have read the same sentence in the painting by Lorenzo Lotto. In Boccaccio's portrayal, Lucretia plunged the knife in her innocent chest and fell on the blade. Her beauty and honesty cannot be praised enough, given how harshly she was treated. I'm quoting Boccaccio. Not only did she choose to die on her own terms, not only was her honor restored after being sullied by the wicked young man, but Rome's freedom followed as well. When we look at these paintings, and this one by Botticelli, we look at a narrative. Something happens here. And this visible tale, in turn, is part of history. A history of visual representations, of course, but also a history of ideas about women, their exposure to violence, their vulnerability, but also their virtues, their agency, their strength, even within the context of patriarchy. A history of norms as well as possibilities. A history of how the disruptive exception of one woman is corporeal, gendered, and political at the same time. By killing themselves, both Antigone and Lucretia act as tyrannicide, so to speak. This history is long, complex, sometimes predictable, sometimes puzzling, surprising. Christianity creates a turning point. But notwithstanding St. Augustine, many Christian readers of Livy and Ovid can see the heroine. Indeed, they could see Lucretia as a woman who, like Antigone and like Cato, knows how to die beautifully, nobly, stoically. And if they are able to see the heroine, can we? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. I think we can have some questions, and there are some questions. There is a question here. We start with a question from the online audience, then we'll have microphones come around the audience here. So we have a question here. How was suicide, the taking of one's own life, viewed in a more general sense during antiquity? Was it accepted universally or under certain circumstances? Was it more common or recorded with regard to women or men, younger or older? That's a very broad question, I mean.
Well, we need another lecture, Davide, here. But it's an important question. And Well, I could immediately think of a book by a French scholar who is very dear to me, Nicole Leroux, who has written precisely on women killing themselves, especially in tragedy, women killing themselves, being married or non-married, with all these variables actually that are very important, not just sociologically, but in terms of experience. And so I hope I'm not eluding the question by saying there is this fantastic, precious book, Tragic Ways of Killing a Woman, that really approaches all these questions. What I can say is that there is one person, one man who has decided to face death and has become the paradigm of all those who decide to face death in antiquity, and this is Socrates, because the paradoxical situation of Socrates is he's been condemned to death by the demos, by the people, and the condemnation consists for him in drinking a poison, and he could flee. His friends try to organize his evasion, but he stays. He explains why death is nothing to be feared, and he is going to drink the poison himself. So that is, in a sense, the culmination of all the possible forms of idealized facing your death deliberately, because you don't want precisely to be a coward, fundamentally. But so yes, in antiquity we have all sorts of cases with a lot of thinking that goes into it.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I really appreciate it, and really interesting to hear all about, the history behind this story. My question is, so Artemisia, she painted those different versions, right? So more than once, and I bet she did it on commission, or she didn't. So someone commissioned that topic or not? Or she was just painting because she liked the topic, or some... And the question is, if the painting was made by commission, who commissioned those ones? Family, and why that particular topic?
Thank you very much for your question, and I'm afraid I will offer a similar response to the previous one. And I'm sure that Davide would be delighted to answer the question of the commission. I mean, something that has been really puzzling for me is may I move here, going back? If I understand well, and I stand to be corrected here, of course, is that this is the face of Artemisia. So the temptation is to connect Artemisia's own existential vicissitude and her own experience of a rape with this coming back to the topic, and even placing herself as a sitter, so to speak, in the story. But I tiptoe there because I know that is an immense domain of knowledge for which I'd better be modest.
Maybe, yeah, I can say. So obviously these paintings were most probably commissioned by someone. We have to think that from the Renaissance onwards, as in some way Julia said, there is this very great interest in classical culture. There is, a return to reading the classical authors. So these stories, these myths, these stories, they come back, and they come back also in paintings a lot. And Lucretia becomes a very popular subject in painting from the Renaissance, especially, in Botticelli, who had the story, but then you had this single depiction of a just the moment of the suicide, and so they were, because she was perceived as a model of virtue in some way, a model of feminine virtue. There is a text very close to the time of Artemisia, which is it's an imaginary gallery of virtuous women, and obviously it's like a tour in an imaginary picture gallery where obviously Lucretia is one of the subjects. Then there was, I don't know, Sophonisba, who's another who drinks the wine. Then there were virtuous wives like Artemisia herself, who was named after the queen of Halicarnassus, who was very faithful wife. So there are different role models for women that were very popular in paintings. We don't know exactly. I mean, Julia, you can show again the painting where she uses her. That single painting is very particular because, not this one, the other. Because we are almost sure, because we know very well the features of Artemisia, that she's using her own body and her own face here. And so I think we cannot think that there was also a very personal component, because we know that obviously she was raped when she was 18 years old. And so, especially in this one painting, there is definitely, we cannot not think that there is a personal component here. There is a sort of a great scholar defined this picture an allegory of vindication, because it's undeniable that there is a personal component here at play. We never want to overplay the card of self-identification with a painter who painted subjects that were mainstream, but in the same time, I think in this case, we can.
We can also.
No, you have your.
Yes, sorry. Also because she comes back so many times to the subject. No, it's fascinating. Thank you, David.
No, it's interesting because, I mean, it was perceived as a virtue, but it was against what the church was, that's what is interesting about that.
It is very interesting.
There was commission in a time where church has a lot of power, and suicide was considered, like a sin. So.
Yes, and this is the challenge. In a sense, in parallel, if we were to look at the iconography of Cato and put them together, in that case too, you have a glorification of Stoicism and the Stoic death. But when we think about Christianity in Europe in the early modern period, the complexity is unbelievable, because you have, Neo-Stoicism. You have women cultivating, reading Seneca and cultivating the model of the Stoic virtues. You have simply what we call humanism. It's all about finding intersections between antiquity and Christianity. So all these ways of dealing with the ethical tradition or the political tradition is negotiated in a very sophisticated ways, and this is what, in a sense, we do when we do history. But also I would like, if it's possible, to add just one little footnote. I have very briefly alluded to the fact that the entire framework of the narrative, both in Livy and Ovid and then in the receptions, when these narratives celebrate Lucretia, they celebrate her chastity. They celebrate her devotion to her husband. They celebrate her abhorrence of the adulterium as adulterium. And therefore, her exceptional strength is inscribed somehow in a context of a very patriarchal vision of the family and patriarchal vision of the entire characterization of the two genders, because it's very interesting to say that no one questions the truth of what she says, the father and the husband, before in Ovid and Livy at least. So you would say, oh, that's wonderful, no one blames the victim. But this has to be understood in the context of a conception of the family in which really the father and the husband has offended as the woman. They must intervene. They cannot somehow try to second guess, because the most important thing is that this cat dared come and has sex with a wife in her conjugal bed, and so the man waged war against that man. So this is why we cannot say, oh, she's a feminist. We are not in France in 68, okay? It's not the feminism of independence and sexual freedom. She's heroic in being completely committed to her role as a chaste wife, a chaste woman. In the same way as Antigone is completely committed to be the sister, the good sister. So these women are completely framed by a system of values, of rules, of regulations, of expectations, and we have to historicize precisely. But within that system, still, they are not cowardly, and they could be cowardly. They could be all like Ismene. We were born women, we don't fight, period, I go home. These women don't do that, even within the context of patriarchy. So this is why they are, yeah, I don't know what to say. The word that comes to mind all the time, explosive, because it is, they really made the exception confirm the possibility of the exception.
Question here.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for your comments. I wonder to what extent, both in Roman times and in the Renaissance, was the Lucretia's story and narrative used as a warning, as a cautionary tale for men and women that were thinking or had committed adultery?
Go back there. You have to go back there.
Yes. Sorry, thank you for the question. Yes, of course. In antiquity, certainly adultery is a very, very serious offense. Once again, context, okay? Adultery doesn't exist for men. Men are unfaithful, it's a sort of by default way of being in the world. It's a statutory form of sexuality. So men do what they want. It's only women. You want to protect marriage, and this is why Augustus's legislation is so keen on precisely reinforcing all the rules and regulations concerning marriage and procreation and adultery as a protection of marriage, legitimate marriage, and legitimate procreation and filiation. So it's all concentrated on the woman. So you would say double standard. Yes, double standard, terrible double standards from our point of view, at least my point of view. But at the same time, these laws are really, really threatening for men because, as I said, you lose half of your possessions. You are thrown into an island, relegatio. You have all sorts of losses of rights that pertain to your identity as a citizen. So you have a lot to lose if you practice adulterium, absolutely. So the story can be seen absolutely as a cautionary tale because in the case of Lucretia, the lover, of course, is punished, and there is a revolution, and the entire monarchy of a relative of the young man is thrown away. So you don't have a tyrannicide, but you have an overthrowing of the king these days. Cautionary tales are always good. And, well,
there is...
yes, so, and in the Renaissance too, you know, what happened is threatening forever.
No, you should stay there. I think it would be nice to conclude with this question from the online audience, which is more bringing Lucretia to today. How is Lucretia, asked one of the listeners, how is Lucretia manifesting in these times? This is the question.
Today?
From Edo. Yes, it means today.
Well, it's an inevitable question. I'm grateful for the question because I was thinking about this all the time. Perhaps the answer is in the key word that we have both pronounced, Davide and I, history. In other words, when we read, and this is a challenge in the classroom, as a teacher, as a professor, I'm very much aware that there are res difficiles, as my colleague Hannah Chulik-Bernd would say. There are topics that are challenging for today's people of any age, especially our students. And it is a real question. How do you situate yourself while reading this text, while looking at these images? And my way of replying to the question, and this concerns Lucretia, but I don't know, it concerns how we read Ovid, how we read love poetry in general, or many other topics. My own response to this question is precisely history, history, history. We have to have a sense of the distance, as a sense of the internal rules and regulations and values that function in a given society. You try to understand, you try to connect one text with the environment in which that text has been created. Doesn't mean a causality, it doesn't mean a determinism. It means a horizon of expectation of what can be understandable. So that, I think, is the way to go. Now, does it mean that because you are a historian, you don't have any judgment? Well, I think we do have a judgment. I think that when I choose my adjectives, when I talk about Sextus Tarquinius, and I enjoy enormously to say that he's ferocious, that's me. I'm there. I'm the historian, but I'm also the person who really feels. I think that we have to be able to do both. We must not take shelter in, or it's history, so I don't want to know, I don't want ideology, I don't want feminist theory, I don't want any of that. I look at the declension. I think that the subjunctive is really very interesting, and you know, the ablative absolute, wow. No, I'm not the kind of person, but at the same time, I'm also engaged in really trying to understand what gives meaning to these particular stories or visual representations or concepts or narrations. So it's a back and forth, if, you know, this is my humble contribution to the thing. Thank you.